Welcome to the Yale-China Association's Fireside Chat. My name is Nancy Almasbach, and I recognize many faces here, but also we want to welcome, in particular, our Yale-China Jia Fellow, as well as Wan Yanhai, the former Yale World Fellow, is also in the room. We want some special guests, as well as 10 guests from the Yale School of Architecture. Welcome today, and I thank you very much for making the extra effort to come out despite the aftermath of the superstorm. But I think we'll have a different type of super conversation today, and I do need to apologize. One of our speakers, Professor Liu, unfortunately could not make it. There is a slight issue in New York City, and he had trouble getting in and returning home, but we will reschedule that. So we're calling this a two-part series. Part one is sort of pre-party Congress, and then we're going to have a part two later in the month that's post-party Congress, because we can't necessarily predict everything that's going to happen, although perhaps Professor Chen and Yuanhua Wen can predict those things. Yale-China, as many of you know, is an independent nonprofit. We do work in education, in health, in service, and leadership, and in the arts. And this is when we come up to the surface and share with you some of the most interesting topics that we've come across. Our work is much more on the ground, working in hospitals, working with young people in exchanges and collaborations, and with physicians and with artists. But this is an opportunity for us to sit back and think a little bit together. So I join you. This is very informal. We really want to hear your input. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions. And how we'll run this is we have exactly 48 minutes, and I'm going to keep us to that. And we're going to have a little moderated conversation with our two guests today, and then prepare your questions. I'll speak with them for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for the balance of that time, so a little under 30 minutes. But please join me in first welcoming Wen Yanhua, the Yale World Fellow. His current position in Tianjin is as the Deputy President of the China Construction Bank. Who has heard of China Construction Bank? Wonderful, so that we have an informed audience. He manages over 6,000 professionals. It's about the size of some of the towns in this neighborhood. And he manages corporate banking, international trade finance, IT, and research and product development departments. And prior to this, his background is really in the banking sector. Many of you know there's been quite a bit of reform in the banking sector over the last 10 to 15 years. He worked at China CITIC Bank, at Central Beijing Company, and which is one of the shareholders of the big four Chinese banks. And he also helped quite significantly in the financial restructuring of ICBC, the International Commercial Bank of China, which is the largest commercial bank in China. So we'll learn a lot more about that over the time. But on a personal note, I think Wen Yanhua is one of those individuals who has really absorbed and engaged the Yale community and the greater New Haven community. He has, you may see him strolling down Prospect Street with a book bag, typically, and he's really been a wonderful addition to this community over the last couple of months. So I encourage you to also find a time to get to know him after our discussion. Professor Chen is no stranger to this community. He is a professor of finance at the Yale School of Management, and he is a renowned and prolific writer on financial concerns, expert on finance theory, securities valuation, emerging markets, and China's economy and capital markets. He sits on a number of public entities listed in China, and actually is renowned, for many of you may know, for having one of the most frequented Weibo sites. So I found this recently. Please look for this. Burst and Marcelo recently put together a book called The 10 Most Influential Political Voices on Weibo. And right at the top is Professor Chen. And every time I bring this up with Professor Chen, he says, I don't know why people, now it's 5 million a day. So every day it seems to multiply exponentially. So welcome, Professor Chen, and thank you very much for sitting in at this 11th hour. Professor Chen is also a Yale-China trustee, so we're very grateful for his appearance today. Welcome. So let's start on this conversation. What is the key, let's just open it up in a very macro sense. Party Congress in a week's time. Yuanhua, what do you think will be the most surprising outcome of the gathering?
Like Chinese way. So first of all, I'd like to say many thanks to Yale-China Association on the name of ordinary citizen from Hunan, from China, because what have you done a lot for during the last century. And the second, I want to say many thanks to Professor Chen Zhiwu. Thanks for your time. I know you are very busy, but also, just like Nancy said, he's very popular in China, and his books and his blogs also playing very significant role in public education about economics and finance. I think just at this point, he's making great achievements to China. Thank you so much. So back to your question, what's the
most surprising outcome do you predict for next week's gathering?
I think maybe everything will continue, not big changes. Maybe some new politician faces emerge, but the policies will continue, especially some of the basic policies like reforming up and opening up. The basic policies like that will continue, is my point.
Professor Chen? You can hold on to the microphone.
Thank you, first of all, to Nancy. I know I have not been as active as I would like with Yale-China activities, so sorry for being too busy.
This is a public apology.
And also today, it's good to share the occasion with Yuanhua, with another very successful Hunanese. So I try to be more neutral, more indifferent to whether somebody is Hunanese or not. But I just cannot help. Once I especially found out a few years ago who would go on Google to search for my Chinese name, then I was surprised to see first Beijing would have the most traffic searching for Chen Zhiwu, and then Hunan. So then I was like thinking, wow, I just cannot help but be very grateful for my Hunanese folks. So they're such a big supporter of me, of mine for so many years. To save time, okay, so on the question Nancy just asked, I think for this party Congress, it's a very tough Congress in the sense that I remember several months ago, after the Chinese New Year, I had a dinner with someone at the Central Party School who's very senior. He said every year, in the past, every time when there was an upcoming party Congress, right after the Chinese New Year, the party chief would bring all the standing committee members and the provincial party secretaries and provincial governors to the Central Party to have this all sort of coordination conference to alert everyone what the main theme would be in the upcoming party Congress. But this year, there was no such an event because they could not agree on a 16-word or 16-character philosophical summary for the upcoming new charter for the party Congress. So as a result of this difficulty to agree on the central philosophy for the party's charter, they decided not to have this meeting at all. So personally, I think this marks the beginning of a new phase for politics, not just for economic policy, economic development in China, but also for political stability. This is really a new beginning, especially now pretty soon, right, there will be 3 surviving presidents at the same time. So each president has its own faction backing him up. So ultimately, one possible surprise coming out of this Congress is some agreement on political reforms.
Senior political officials and retired senior political officials seek to converse with you about issues on the global scale, on the global scene.
Only the people from the right, so not
right.
the left.
What is the most popular first question that they'll ask you? What are the topics that always seem to percolate?
They typically ask, what China has to do on the reform side.
Is it a desperate ask?
So that's very typical. But of course, often I will say, well, yeah, political reforms is a must. But I realize it's difficult to do. I think at this point, fortunately, especially after the removal, after the scandal of Xilai and his people, I think for the most part, all the conversations and the public debates are more or less converged to a pretty believable consensus that political reforms are no longer avoidable. So that's why I think recently I've been somewhat more encouraged that something will happen. To what extent and how far they will go is hard to say.
Yuanhua, when we think about how much, in the mind, there's a mind share. So 100% of your thinking in the mind. What percentage do you think Chinese officials are thinking about domestic issues? And what percentage do you think they're thinking about foreign policy issues?
I think maybe more than 80%, they will think about the domestic issues. Because, the many issues they are facing is imbalance from domestic. And I think the imbalance from outside just is another side of the coin, also another side in the mirror. So I think that's the right way. And the biggest challenge in China, I think, first one is the low consumption rate and export-led economic development style. The second one, I think, is the inequality of social development, the inequality of income, the inequality of development chances. And maybe the third one is the political reform, just Professor Chen mentioned, because every reform and opening up have to be based on the political system, based on the rule of law, something like that.
Thank you. The predicted future leader of China, Xi Jinping, many of you know that his daughter, I believe, is enrolled at a university north of us. I'm curious, Professor Chen, and then Yuanhua, what you think the influence might be. Professor Chen, you have a daughter who's enrolled at the right university, Yale, and there are influences that young people always give their parents. What have you heard, or do you anticipate or forecast any sort of Western influences that have occurred within Xi Jinping's thinking? If so, in what direction would one see any sort of integration of any sort of Western influence?
I think Debbie can say more. If I have to guess, probably not that much influence yet, because typically in a Chinese family, the father is way up there, daughters, sons, they're too young. What do they know? That is not known to the father. So but I have to say, probably for people like Xi Jinping, the structure is a little bit more horizontal than the traditional Confucian vertical hierarchical relationship. So in that sense, I think his daughter probably can have some influence, indirect. But usually, I think, from what I know, the children are not supposed to talk to their parents about political such children, usually their parent, their father, would tell them just not mess with professional, political topics. But sometimes they do want to. It really depends on the child. But on the other hand, in general terms, I think it's very interesting, right? When Yuanhua Wen started this whole process 150 years ago, and then from him to the collapse of the Qing dynasty, the overseas educated returnees to China played a major role. And then during the Republican period, if you look at the minister-level officials in the Republican government in the 30s and 40s, most of them probably were educated in American universities and European universities. So for China today, I see this coming up again. So Yale educated and other American university educated officials now are among the divisional chief and vice minister rank circles, there are many of them. I think there's no vice premier yet, but the full minister rank level officials, there are a few already. But I think in the next 5 years we'll see more, especially Mr. Yuanhua Wen. I think he has made a genuine effort to promote more Western educated returnees to more influential positions, although he has not really publicly sort of highlighted this.
Audience, prepare your questions, and I have a few more, and then we're going to head to it. Yuanhua, let me revise that question in your particular instance. Might you speak personally from your experience at Yale over the last several months? What is the most influential factor that's changed your outlook, if at all? And what will you bring back to what you're doing in the Chinese banking system and to the global, the Chinese economy as your role in that might continue to develop?
That's a very, very good question. For this month, for these 2 months, especially last week, we had a retreat. We discussed about this question. For me, I think the most important, I'm constructing an international platform. I know a lot of people from all over the world, our fellow 6 people from 14 countries. They have totally different vision about the future, about the common issues of the world. So I learned a lot from them. And then I think the knowledge from Yale also gave me a lot, encouraged me to study more. This is a very, very good education environment. So as regard the question just you asked Professor Chen, I totally agree with him on his point, because maybe now is impossible for the younger children to influence their parents, but in the future they have big influence, because it's a window, it's a channel to communicate. That's very important to the future of China.
Let's segue to the U.S. elections really quickly. One just quick question on that. How do you feel, Yuanhua, that the reality of the U.S. elections as you've been observing it from the U.S. side compares to the way the Chinese media, there's been always so much criticism of the U.S. media, but how does the Chinese media depict what's going on in the U.S. elections? Do you feel that they are equal, or is there any sort of nuanced understanding that you can share with us?
Yes. I watched the debate of the election in the U.S., but I also read some articles from China about how they watch the debate in the U.S. I think more and more Chinese people are paying attention to U.S. election. So I read a report, maybe now 1/3 of Chinese people are watching the debate online. It's a big increase, compared with the 17% in 2008. That's a good sign for good communication for both countries. But most of the people, especially the young students in university, they watching the debate, just watching the football game, just for fun. But there are some students, they are listening to the content carefully and try to learn something from this process. It's very good. So there are many Chinese media, they are updating the election campaign almost every day, like Caixin, like China News, many Chinese media, they are doing that. So I think everything is changing. But they are feel not good about the way Chinese the U.S. candidates always taking China as the election punchback. They feel not happy about that.
Professor Chen, you're used to the word pessimism earlier, that he's actually more pessimistic than you. Is your pessimism also in China's economic growth, and can you be specific in which areas? There was a recent infrastructure package that was approved, $157 billion. It seemed like a response to slowing growth. Could you share a little bit about your insights, maybe 3 main areas that you're looking at that you're particularly pessimistic about?
The local governments doing too much in the infrastructure and real estate, especially airports and highways, high-speed train lines being built. So that's one area that can really be a landmine, a timing bomb, ticking bomb for China, the economy. And then the state-owned enterprises, they are doing too much and becoming more important in the economy, wasting a lot of resources at the expense of the private sector. And then the inequality, kind of related, the inequality issue related to politics and so on. But with the government playing bigger roles and the SOEs playing increasingly larger roles as well, inequality becomes even more extreme. So I would say the government with whatever efforts, especially I think after the Party Congress, and then in particular after the March National People's Congress session, the stimulus efforts will speed up again. I would be surprised if they will stay away from such efforts. So they will try the same old methods of using infrastructure and SOE projects to try to create a false, positive environment for next year at the expense of a very unavoidable crisis, maybe 3 to 5 years from now. So I'm pessimistic in the sense that 3 to 5 years from now, probably a crisis is actually needed and would be healthy for China's long-term development. Because otherwise, I just don't see how this irrational dependence on government spending on infrastructure and SOEs, I don't see how this can be reversed or changed in any significant way until there is a crisis.
I'd like to add some comments about this topic. So let's look at the difference between this package and the previous one in 2008. I think there are 2 points. One is this package focuses on concrete projects, and which is generally speaking is better than the previous one. In 2008, at the time, we pumped a huge money into many unnecessary projects, which wasted a lot of money. And the second, this time, you cannot find the concrete finance arrangement attached to this package, which means if your local government want to do this project, you have to fund the money by yourself. And banks, if you want to follow this package, you have to make the decision based on the return of risk principles. And also you have to make the decision by yourself. So for the last several months, as you can say, the total bank loan has not reached too much because of this, this new package. So that's the biggest difference. Maybe people from bank, from government, they still remember the negative impact of last time. And I think this package has negative impact or positive impact. Negative side, just like Professor Chen said, it will continue to enlarge the excessive the producing capacity, which will be a burden in the long term for the future. And will continue to enlarge the inequality of the income because people close to this project have more chance to get the money. And also strengthen the status of SOE and increasing private sectors out, which will influence the economic efficiency and the economic development vitality in the future. But there's some active impact. In short time, maybe we'll stop the downturn of the economic development. In the long term, this kind of infrastructure will generate the new growth of the economy. And because, generally, China's capital stock is per capita, per worker, just 1/10 of that of Japan, which means we have a big room to fill. We need more infrastructure. But the question which I'm worrying about is how we can choose this project and how we can make sure this investment process be efficient.
Let me open it up to the floor. Please raise your hand if you have a question. If I can ask our speakers to share a microphone to respond. Any questions over here? Any questions? Let me ask you another question then. What do you think is...
Let me
okay.
add
Oh, yeah, please. There's a debate.
concrete example. It's, a lot of the official statistics show out of the 24 sectors that make up the Chinese economy, 23 have a very severe overcapacity problem. So, especially if you look at the steel industry, over the last 4 or 5 years, the total increase in steel manufacturing capacity in China is more than, I think, all the world's total capacity combined, excluding China's. So there's just too much investment in the steel industry. But still, even over the last few months, right, the central government planning agency still approved a few more major investment projects to make steel and iron. So, of course, you wonder why they always like such big projects. A few years ago, I took some MBA students to visit China as part of the SOM international trip requirement. I found the students to be the most excited when we were visiting the steel assembly line, production lines, because they look so grand, with a big chunk of steel that's red hot, right? Being flipped around like we flip a pencil at such ease. And also the scale of production was so grand. So visually speaking, that's the best place to visit. Instead of going to Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan offices in Beijing, where what difference can you actually see between there in Beijing, Shanghai, and New York, or New Haven for that matter? But the steel manufacturing floors can be totally different. So for the same reason, for government budgetary planners, when you apply for such a very concrete investment project, the planners can relate to such projects so much better than they can relate to educational increases, health improvement expenditures, because all those expenditure items are very important to individuals, households, but they're not visible. terms of the actual result, the actual benefit. So as an economist, we always think about performance measurement. Right? How do you measure performance when you invest in intangible health and education and other things, as opposed to investing in very tangible steel production lines? Big difference.
Thank you, Professor Chen. Here's a question.
Thank you, Professor Chen and Mr. Wen. My question is more related to the, other than economic development, but more related to the environmental impact of the economic development. So, judging from the current pace and the scale of the development in China, do you think that in the future 10 years there will be any possibility of improvement for the environmental quality? And also, for the coming party congress, do you think that the current party leaders have more dedication to improve the environmental quality of China? Thank you.
Okay. I think the situation is getting better. For example, when I do my business in China, when I investment loan, one of the criteria is the environmental theory. We got to abide by the rules from the government. And then we also not only bank, many other companies when they are launching the new project, you have to pay more attention to the pressure from the public. As you can see, there are many social unrest result from this kind of problems. So this is also a kind of grassroots of democracy. It's a good sign for China. I believe that the government will follow this trend of social movement and will do better than before.
Additional questions? Yes, sir. Let me come around. Again, please identify yourself and question, not a comment.
Yes, thanks. So my name is Henry Auer. I publish a blog on global warming, and it's related to the previous question, but perhaps slightly different. Of course, China's economy has been expanding for the last 20 years at 8–10% every year, which means, of course, that their demands for energy expand at the same rate. And currently, China is the largest consumer of energy, mostly fossil fuel energy in the world, and continuing to grow. It's projected that its growth will continue more or less along the same path, producing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. In any general way, I was wondering if either both of you could comment on the projected path that the government has for moving away from fossil fuels, or developing renewable energy, or staying on the same path. It's my understanding that in the past, at least, they have emphasized what is called improving energy intensity, which means improving the efficiency of using the energy that is consumed, while this necessarily still includes large increases in emissions. So I wonder if you have any comments on that. Thank you.
So this question, I see from two different angles. Maybe on one hand, you can see many reports about China's international action on the carbon emission, and I know China is the biggest one in the world, and they always, ask the developed countries to take the responsibility for what they have done before. And we are in the developing process. This is the one voice from the government to the outside of the world. But on the other hand, I know we are doing inside of China a lot. For instance, we you can see many this kind of measures in our 12-5C development plan. And first, we should, transform our economic development style, and then try to make innovation to use our energy more efficiently than before. And then we were trying to change our energy structure. Now, 75% of China's energy made from coal and oil, 27% from water, obviously, and just 3% are from nuclear. That's America. That's totally different with the American's energy structure. And also, the Chinese government are doing a lot of public education to its people to save energy, to change their life's way, to try to make our earth more green.
Additional questions? Oh, question.
Yeah, okay. Let me mention maybe 3 quick points. One is, it's understandable that China would produce on a per capita basis more increase in carbon emissions because China has become the world's manufacturing center, exporting a lot of the products. So what that means is a lot of carbon emission should have been moved to China from other countries as a result of this. So it's not avoidable. So in this sense, for China to really reduce its net contribution each year to carbon emission, the renminbi exchange rate should actually appreciate faster to make China less of the world's factory. So that's one way to go. So in this sense, if China would do this, then it's very consistent with what both Obama and Romney would want, and also with improving the Chinese environment going forward. And secondly, on the renewable energy side, because I personally invested in some of the wind and solar energy firms in China. Of course, as a result of this big expansion, especially over the last 5 to 8 years in solar panel manufacturing and wind turbine manufacturing, so prices for solar panels and wind turbine machines have all come down very fast, especially for solar energy. The cost has dramatically increased as a result of this crazy over-investment by local governments in China. Of course, that's, this development by China over the last 4 or 5 years especially should really be very great news for renewable energy growth, globally speaking. Because otherwise, all those solar panels and other equipment would be too expensive for any country to put more such renewable energy units in place. But actually, the outcome is bad for China domestically and bad for China, for how China has been received globally. Because every country has been blaming China. So Obama has been going after China for exporting too many cheap solar equipment and wind turbines. So tariffs and other sanctions have been introduced. And then in Western Europe, very similar reactions. So you're made to wonder, China has really tried to use so much of its domestic capital to overproduce in the renewable energy area. But the world has not welcomed, and actually the Chinese citizens should also be really upset with this, because all those bank loans and capital resources could have been used to help private entrepreneurs and households to improve their lives and livings in other ways. But instead, all the local governments have channeled so much of the loans and other capital resources to renewable energy. But in the end, the local governments have not been appreciated by neither the domestic population nor the international community. So my third point is, on the other hand, as long as the SOEs still dominate the Chinese economy, as long as local governments play a major role in resource allocations and investment project decision making, then the environment-unfriendly projects will be more heavily favored, unfortunately. So that's the economic structure created by the political structure that's in place. So ultimately, to change this, then political reforms have to take place.
Wonderful, thank you.
My name is Laurie Corsorio. I'm an investor dealing with China. And you referenced the increase in China's steel capacity. And I wonder how that was related to their automobile plans for their, I think it's called the Cherry. Could you give us some insight into that?
Cherry is a privately owned company out of Zhejiang province. When they were working on the Volvo acquisition, they really tried, the chairman really tried to get the government support. In the end, I think he succeeded, although I was a little bit upset with some of the things he was saying to try to please the government so that he would get the government support in providing loans to make this effort. But overall, I think the whole setup is biased against private players like Cherry. So that's why the chairman has to work extra hard to say things that the party likes to hear. Whereas the SOE executives don't necessarily have to go out of their way to show their allegiance to the party that much. So going forward, I would say the private automakers of China, even though they're more efficiency-oriented, they're more driven than the SOEs, still the government, the central government may not be as supportive of them as the local governments are. Because the local governments, at the end of the day, they are more interested in the local GDP and local employment, and especially for provinces like Zhejiang, where the private sector really dominates, then the local governments have to support the SOE. So I would say at this point, given the extremely crowdedness in terms of traffic in Beijing, Guangzhou, and all the major, as well as second-tier cities, the fast growth that we have seen over the last 5 years, especially as a result of the financial crisis, the government relied on the auto industry a lot to provide a lot of incentives and support. So personally, I don't see that to continue too much because the traffic is just so unbearable all over China. So unless maybe the U.S. economy really picks up again to, of course, I want to see this, to be able to buy some of the overcapacity in China, to buy cars exported or imported from China to the U.S. Otherwise, I think the auto industry may be too crowded already. And going forward, it will take a while for the overcapacity to be used up by the domestic increase in demand for automobiles.
Final question from the audience, and then we'll wrap up with predictions.
My name is Greg Smart, and I do some consulting in China, educational consulting. My question is, I was very happy to see in Beijing near the university that there was a very crowded, large Starbucks, bigger than this, full of happy students with laptops listening to John Mayer and all manner of American music. And I had a chance to speak with some of them, and it was very vital, very vibrant, much more open than I had anticipated from American newsmedia. My question is, with the new leadership, is there any plan to crack down on censorship, intellectual property appropriation, and the counterfeiting of manufactured goods? We're going to end with a bang here.
Wow, that's the big question, right?
There you go.
I think to be fair to a lot of the insiders in the Chinese government, the central government agencies have been very genuine in trying to crack down on intellectual property violations and stealing. What is really difficult, it's really difficult to actually get all the central government directives and regulations enforced is at the local government level. So over the years I've spoken with mayors, provincial governors and so on. They would say, yeah, it's very easy for the officials in Beijing to always talk big, just try to protect intellectual property and so on. But we here, we have to be responsible for the fiscal revenue increase, for employment and for GDP growth. And if we really crack down very hard, then quite a few of the local employers will have to be shut down. So in fact, a few years ago, one of my brothers, his mining company, it was a very minor one anyway. I think they were mining copper. It was shut down 100%. Of course, he got a good return back for his investment. But then the reason that their mining company had to be shut down was because this time in Hunan province, a few years ago, that means, the provincial government was really serious to improve worker conditions and safety, and also to really get rid of polluting firms, and also, of course, at the same time, maybe get rid of those counterfeiting firms in whatever products. As a consequence of this effort, across the province, many firms were shut down. But of course, that was under a very, very serious instruction from the central government in Beijing. So the local governments found that time to be hard to get around. So they had to be really serious in closing down a lot of the firms. But from my knowledge, I know, I learned, I observed too, many of the local government officials were lobbying very hard in Beijing to get them to loosen the enforcement of this new directive from the central government. So I think the incoming leadership, I believe they will be very serious and very genuine too, because many scholars and advisors have made it very clear, unless the intellectual property protection is more reliable or more in place in China, the software industry, the film, movie industry, and music industry, and other cultural industries in China just cannot boom or develop that much further. So they understand the seriousness, but again, at the local government level, it's a different story, and they face different incentives.
Yuanhua?
I agree with Professor Chen's point. I think even in many universities, they did a lot of research on the relations between the economic performance and the intellectual protection. So we have the consensus we should protect, and that's the only way to improve our industry's level and to promote our economic transformation. Yes, the central government are thinking about that, but the incentive for the local government, that's a different story. Maybe they're trying to find loophole to do something. But as a whole country, we realize that we should protect the intellectual property.
Wonderful. Let me just end with some prediction questions. One, so just answer yes or no, or better or worse. One, U.S.-China relations in 5 years, better or worse?
Better.
Worse.
So this is where we really get what we think. This is the McLaughlin style. Income equality or inequality. Less equality
It's hard to say.
No. One
It's
or
we
the other.
got to choose. And the rhythm, maybe income more unequal.
Yeah, more inequality.
In 5 years' time, the Chinese government, will it be better received or worse received by the Chinese population?
Maybe better.
Worse. Yeah.
In 5 years, will we be post a crisis in China or waiting for a crisis in China? Or no crisis in China?
Within 5 years
5 years from now. Yeah.
from now, so it can be tested. I think it's no crisis.
I think either close or in the middle of a crisis.
Obama or Romney?
Obama.
Yeah, I think Obama. Yeah.
Good.
Can you please join me in thanking Yuanhua and especially if Professor Chen, in your capacity as Yale-China trustee, can you join me in just presenting a thank you gift to Yuanhua? This is a gift from one of our partners who has published this book and given it to us as a special gesture. This is Courses for Perpetuity and for Eternity, and we hope that you will always be a friend to Yale-China and to the Hunan people and to our relationship with the Hunan people. So thank you so much. Please, yeah.